Thank you for tuning in to another episode of The Launchpad. I'm your host, Dave Kluge, and as always, joined with two great guests. Today, I've got Pat Fitzmaurice from Fantasy Pros and Jay Arsht from High Floor Football. We're going to be looking back at the 2022 season and talking about some of our best and worst picks at every single position. Most importantly, though, we're going to be talking about these guys heading into 2023 and how we feel about them. After an extremely disappointing season, are you going to be drafting Deontay Johnson and DeAndre Swift again? Can we buy into the hype with Justin Fields? Is he the real deal next year as an elite Konami code quarterback? We're going to discuss all of that in a very great show and also talk about the Footballguys rookie draft guide, which you need to be sure to check out. Be sure to stick through to the very end of this week's episode of The Launchpad. Who are the best and worst picks from the 2022 fantasy football season? That and so much more on today's episode of The Launchpad. As always, joined with two great guests today, episode 59 now. Took a few weeks off, wanted to really enjoy the playoffs as a football fan rather than a football analyst and enjoy the playoffs I have. But now as we are creeping up to the offseason, it is time to jump back in the show. So you'll be seeing me every week between now and week one kickoff. Today, I'm joined with Pat Fitzmaurice and Jay Arsht, two good friends of mine, and we are going to be looking back at the 2022 season, talking about best and worst picks and what we learned. First of all, let me go ahead and introduce Pat. Pat, you are over at Fantasy Pros doing a ton of awesome work over there. Why don't you let everyone know where they can find you on social media and what you got going on this offseason?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Dave. What off season? I mean, we're already digging into the rookie class and talking about that on shows and putting together rookie rankings for all the Dynasty League enthusiasts out there. But so people can catch me on Twitter at Fitz_FF and hear me on Fitz on Fantasy and on the Fantasy Pros Dynasty podcast.
Yeah, staying really busy there. And, I'll just expand on that for a quick second. When I first got into the industry and realized I could turn this into a full-time gig, I was like, this is great. I only got to work 18 months out of the year and then I get all the rest of the year off. No, sir. The NFL is a 365-day-a-year media machine. They always give us something to talk about. Before we dive into these players, though, let me go ahead and introduce Jay Arsht. You can find all of Jay stuff over at High Floor Football. Jay, you and I, how long ago was that I hopped on a show with you and Sam Wagman? That had to have been about 2 years ago or so. It's been quite a bit of time now.
It has been a while, Dave. Good to see you. Nice to meet you, Pat. Thanks for having me on your show. I know you got nominated recently for the best fantasy podcast, so congratulations on that. And yeah, man, I'm excited. Like Pat said, off season. What off season? I'm going to quote Jalen Hurts here and say season's not over yet. So we still got a little bit left, and the off season starts pretty quickly. So I'm excited to be on and excited to kind of recap, a little bit of last season.
Yeah, we're sitting here talking about the offseason. For anybody that's listening to this on podcast audio only, Jay is sitting here repping his Philadelphia Eagles hat. He is amped up for Sunday's game, as I'm sure you can imagine. Before we dive into this, though, just want to remind everybody to subscribe on YouTube, youtube.com/footballguys. That way you get a sneak peek at all of our videos before they hit audio feeds. You can find them at youtube.com/footballguys. And then if you're listening and you enjoy the show, give us a thumbs up on YouTube and give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you are listening to. Now, like I said at the beginning of the show, today we're going to be talking about some best and worst picks. And let's start off with quarterbacks. Pat, start us off here. Who was the best pick that you could have made at the quarterback position from 2022?
Well, Dave, this is going to seem like pandering knowing who you cheer for, but I couldn't pick anyone other than Justin Fields. I mean, he was a true difference maker who was going in the double-digit rounds in a lot of cases. And, we've talked about this on my show a couple of weeks ago. There is still untapped passing upside here. We saw what the rushing upside was. I mean, he set the record for most rushing yards by a quarterback in a game. It just happened to be in a week where I was going against him in a key league. And he never had more than 28 pass attempts in any game this past season. His single game passing high for yardage was 254 yards. And his second highest game with passing yardage was 208 yards. So we know he's going to get better weaponry. I mean, it's pretty much impossible to have a worse wide receiver room than the Bears had this past year. And, we just never should have been letting a Konami code guy fall so late in drafts last year.
Yeah, and I'm looking right now at the numbers. He was getting drafted as QB 17, finished the year as QB 6. But I think what's craziest is these first 5 weeks of the season, he was awful. I mean, he was dropped in every single league that he was drafted in, unless you're in, a dynasty super flex league, obviously. But any sort of redraft league, he was on waivers by week 5, and that's when he really kicked it up. And the Bears kind of knocked the training wheels off the offense, and that's when we saw Justin Fields start to run a lot more. And from week 5 onward, he was actually the QB3 in scoring. Jalen Hurts and Patrick Mahomes were the only guys that were putting up more points per game. So Justin Fields right now getting drafted as QB6, QB7 in way too early rankings. It wouldn't surprise me if he cracks the top 5 next year, because we know what this guy can do on the ground. Jay, let's throw it over to you. Who was your favorite quarterback pick from the 2022 season?
Well, I promise this is my only homer pick here. It's my only Eagle pick, and I think there could have been others, but I am going with Jalen Hurts, and I don't think that I think it's fitting, that he was the best quarterback pick. He finished QB1 on the season, averaged 25 points per game, and he was being drafted as the QB5, going off of Footballguys ADP from September 7th. He was being drafted as QB5, 59th overall, so that's like the 4th, 5th round. We all expected a jump from Jalen Hurts. We expected him to have a successful season, but he was still being drafted after, Josh Allen, Mahomes, Herbert, Lamar Jackson, and right before Kyler Murray. And, when you really think about it, these are all great players, but averaging 25 points per game versus, Justin Herbert's 17 points per game is significant. Week to week, Jalen was one of the more consistent quarterbacks. He only had 2 games this season under 20 points. So, if you're banking on 20 points a week from your quarterback, you were pretty solid with Jalen Hurts there. And he was over 25 points 8 times. So Jalen Hurts had a really successful season. I mean, he won you a lot of weeks. At the end of the season, he ripped off, like 3 30-pointers. So guys that you missed on when you took Josh Allen a couple rounds ahead of Jalen Hurts, were A.J. Brown, Jalen Waddle, T. Higgins. That's big for your roster if you waited a couple rounds and drafted Jalen Hurts a few rounds later. So he was my best pick this year, and I had him on a lot of teams, thankfully. And the consistency was great to rely on. So I couldn't fault anybody for taking, Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, even Justin Herbert over him at the start of the season. But now that we've seen what we've seen, I think it was extremely impressive.
Yeah, and now we've got this kind of bunch of really elite quarterbacks sitting at the top. And the difference that you got from one of those guys, if you had a Justin Fields, Patrick Mahomes, Jalen Hurts, compared to what you were getting from back-end QB1 production, we talked about this on the Pretend GM last week with Alfredo Brown, but you were getting a 7-point advantage if you had Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, Patrick Mahomes, one of these guys, compared to the Kirk Cousins and the Tom Brady's at back-end quarterback. So I think we're going to see a pretty big tier break heading into 2023 drafts, where people are really going to want those elite quarterbacks because they made a huge difference this year. So let me just, before we move on to running backs, let me throw a question out here for both of you. It seems like over the years now, we're starting to notice this trend. It's mobile year 2 quarterbacks really step up big time. We saw it in 2019. Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson both having great seasons in year 2. Kyler Murray did in 2020. We saw Jalen Hurts in 2021 start to break out a little bit, even though he stepped up even more in 2022. And then last year we saw it with Justin Fields. So are there any guys from last year's class that are going into their second year that you can get excited about? I know it was a weird year where Kenny Pickett was the only first-round quarterback. So Pat, let me throw it to you first. Any year 2 guys that are piquing your interest?
Honestly, no. Not really with that class. Like, I mean, there wasn't enough from Malik Willis to get like a good feeling about him. Kenny Pickett, I feel like, was sort of drafted. I just didn't really like the draft profile because he was kind of a one-year wonder and didn't pop until his 5th year senior year. Yeah, I'm kind of not very enthusiastic about any of these guys. I don't think Desmond Ridder is an NFL caliber passer. So, yeah, I don't know. I wish I could zero in on a guy like that, but yeah, I don't know if I have one.
Is it maybe cheating to say Trey Lance? I mean, he's technically going into year 3, but you know what? He's got, I think, 3 total starts, maybe 4 total starts this year. Maybe he's the guy that we want to bet on going into 2023.
Yeah.
Ooh, Jay,
I know it's
coming
a little
through loud and clear now.
That was kind of the same direction I was going to go with Trey Lance. It's tough. Last year's class didn't give us a lot to get excited about. Aside from Kenny Pickett did finish off the year pretty strong. And, we'll see if the Malik Willis profile ever comes to be what we thought it could. But, Trey Lance really is the one. And realistically, it's almost like the MLB, when you talk about rookie of the year and he missed a certain amount of games. Trey Lance missed enough where I would say that going into his second year wouldn't be too much of a stretch considering how little we've seen of him.
Yeah, that's a regular conversation that we actually have on the Pretend GM, joking around that this was really Travis Etienne's rookie year. Like, yeah, sure, Travis Etienne, it might technically be your year 2 for him, but yeah, I think we kind of get that NBA rookie, NBA year 2. Now let's go ahead and talk about running backs for a little bit. And Pat, I will have you start us off again here. Who do you think was the best running back pick that you could have made in 2022?
Josh Jacobs. And congratulations to the true believers who stuck with him. And, it's funny because some people would maybe call him a dead zone running back, but in some leagues that I was in, he was being drafted beyond the dead zone. And I think it sort of left a negative impression that the Raiders elected not to pick up his 5th-year option. But maybe we misinterpreted that because that sort of freed up the Raiders to work him into the ground in his last year with the team before entering free agency. So, probably the other thing, where he was picked, he was routinely going to the 0 RB drafters and the nearly 0 RB drafters. So those people, getting some primo wide receivers at the top of the draft, then hitting on Josh Jacobs a little later in like the 6th or 7th round. And I don't know, maybe it was just we shouldn't have been letting a guy who we knew to be pretty talented and who was in line for decent touch volume. We shouldn't have been turning up our noses on a guy like that.
Yeah, and it was all because of Josh McDaniels, right? Like, that was the only thing that we could use to knock Josh Jacobs. We're like, all right, yeah, sure, he's young, he's talented, he's on an explosive offense, he catches the ball, he's a great runner. But Josh McDaniels, I don't want anything to do with that. I think we might have overthought that one a little bit this offseason. I'm going to pat myself on the back a little bit, and I'll try not to do it too hard. But let me read off a tweet from myself that I fired off last offseason. It said, James Conner, Ezekiel Elliott, Cam Akers, Breece Hall, Travis Etienne, David Montgomery, J.K. Dobbins, Josh Jacobs. The running back dead zone doesn't look so dead this year. And it really wasn't. I think that we need to kind of reshape the way that we look at the running back dead zone, because what it used to be is that the running back dead zone were the guys that were lead backs that you knew were going to get volume, but weren't especially talented. Now the running back dead zone, I don't know if you can really call it that anymore, because just about every running back is splitting touches. So whether you're taking a guy in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, or 7th, 8th, and 9th round, they're going to be splitting work with somebody. So I think that you can find talented running backs all throughout, the draft board this year. And Jay, that brings me to my next question. Who was your favorite running back selection from the 2022 year?
My favorite one, and again, similar to what you said, not to pat myself on the back, but I did have a lot of him, and it was Ramondre Stevenson. He, I think, was one of the best picks for a stretch during the season. From weeks 3 to 13, he scored double digits in all of those weeks. So, that was a good guy to have in your lineup. He was breaking 20 every now and then. He had 6 games over 20 points. He was being drafted as the RB 29 around the 6th, 7th round, which was more of a depth pick. I think a lot of people saw the upside with him. But it was, there were people who liked Damian Harris as well, who was going to take a lot of touches, and he did to start the season. So it was a little bit rocky for Ramondre to start the first couple weeks. He ended up finishing as the RB11, 14 points per game. And guys being drafted ahead of him, we were taking A.J. Dillon, Chase Edmonds, Clyde Edwards-Helaire was somebody that I was taking in a lot of best ball drafts, thinking he was a great value. It was a little bit of a slow start for Ramondre, but he really got going, and he was one of the more consistent running backs for a pivotal stretch of the season. So he's, was a great pick then. I think he's going to be a great pick in the future as well. I think Ramondre Stevenson is here to stay. So I really liked him. I thought he was one of the best value picks of the running back position this year.
Yeah. And you say RB11. That was I don't know if that was his standard or his half PPR, but in full PPR, he actually finishes the RB7. So, really putting up elite production there. And like you said, that was when he was splitting touches with Damian Harris early in the year. So you alluded to it a little bit. You said that you're going to have a lot of him next year. Are you getting concerned at all, just with tendencies of Bill Belichick, that maybe there is more of a split? Kevin Harris and Pierre Strong, 2 young guys that might step up a little bit. Or do you think Ramondre Stevenson has just shown enough over these last 2 years that Bill Belichick is going to continue riding him?
Sure. Dave, I know you get into the narratives a little bit too, as I do. And if you heard Bill Belichick talk about Ramondre Stevenson, he mentions him in some pretty rare conversations with other legends that he's had and that he's coached over his tenure. I I get it. I think that the Patriots thing can be frustrating sometimes with the backfields, but I also think it's overblown sometimes. I think Damian Harris actually had some success, 2 years ago, was looking successful this year. There's a strong running game. I expect their offense to get better. I think Ramondre just has an interesting skill set that that a lot of people were late to, I guess, because he doesn't look as much like the receiving back that he is. Or that he's used as. So I think a lot of us were a little bit late to the party thinking like, I don't know if this guy's actually going to be used like that. And midway through the season, we're like, this guy's being used like Alvin Kamara. He's getting all the pass catching work. So I'm not so worried. I don't know if he's going to finish, top 10 next year. I don't know if he's going to be drafted then. We'll see what happens with the Patriots backfield, and with Damian Harris, he's a free agent. So we'll see what happens with him. But I do like Ramondre Stevenson going into next year as well.
Yeah, and talk about going right down narrative street. On the Footballguys channel, Sigmund Bloom, he's the one that does it more often than anybody. But I like to do it as well. And I think one of the things that really jumped out to me this year was in the game against Cincinnati, where Ramondre Stevenson had fumbles on back-to-back drives and still went out there for the very next drive. That is not something that you ever see from Bill Belichick. You make a mistake and you're riding pine for the rest of the game. And even after 2 fumbles, he was still getting the majority of the workload. So yeah, Bill Belichick definitely loves this guy. Before we go into wide receivers, Pat, I'm going to put you on the spot and throw a question here. Assuming Damian Harris walks in free agency and there isn't any notable free agent that signs in the Patriots backfield, where do you think Ramondre Stevenson ends up getting drafted next year?
Oh man, I'm doing a best ball draft right now, and I think Stevenson went towards the back end of the second round in a PPR draft. Yeah, so definitely in the high rent district now. But just to echo what Jay said, like I think Belichick is going to sing a different tune with Stevenson than he usually does. Like I think he's his new version of Corey Dillon, where he just trusts him to be the workhorse. And we saw like he and Harris were splitting carries to begin the 2022 season, and they just shifted it towards Stevenson, like away from Harris, even when Harris was healthy. So like I do believe the narrative about like Belichick really talking up this guy, and a lot of times that's just coach speak, but really Belichick is not one of those guys who'll gush about players if they don't, if he doesn't really believe it. And it's obvious he likes Stevenson quite a bit.
Yeah, and if he's going in the back of the second right now, I could actually see him moving up from there because really this guy just has the perfect profile that you want to see in a running back. I mean, he's on a team that likes to run the ball a lot. He catches passes and he's going to get the goal line work. So if he's able to make it unscathed through free agency, it wouldn't surprise me if he ends up creeping up into that 1-2 turn because like you said, he's got the narrative, he's got the profile, and he's got the production over the last 2 years. So Ramondre Stevenson is going to be a fun guy to talk about this offseason. Now let's go ahead and talk about some wide receivers here. Pat, there's a lot of guys that we could have gone with here. I mean, there were some big breakouts this year. Who do you think was the best wide receiver selection from last year?
Definitely a lot of options here. And I'm going to go chalk sort of with Tyreek Hill, who actually wasn't like a later round pick. But man, and you could make a really good case for either of the Miami receivers here because Jalen Waddle was being drafted like a mid-range wide receiver 2 and produced like a mid-range wide receiver 1. But I think it was even gutsier to spend a second round pick last year on Tyreek Hill, who was joining a new team, losing Patrick Mahomes, competing with targets for with this excellent rookie who had come in and had a 1,000-yard season in year 1. And we didn't know whether Tua was going to be any good or not. There was some debate about that. I mean, some people were a little more pro Tua than others, but a lot of variables here. We didn't know what the Mike McDaniel offense was going to look like, but taking that leap of faith with Hill was just so profitable this year. 20.1 PPR points per game and a wide receiver 2 finish, just a true difference maker.
Yeah, I mean, can't push back on anything you said there. And I may have patted my back talking about the running back dead zone and Josh Jacobs a little bit earlier, but I'll show both sides of the coin because I was so wrong on Tyreek Hill. I was saying all offseason that I didn't think Tua had the ability to support 2 wide receiver 1s, and that's pretty much where both of those guys were getting drafted. I mean, I think Jalen Waddle was technically wide receiver 16 or 18 or something when the season kicked off, but people put a lot of faith in Tua being able to support a high-powered offense. I was not buying into it, but there was the whole debate, is Tyreek Hill really that good or was he just a product of Patrick Mahomes? And I think that, we saw that it's both. Patrick Mahomes is an amazing football player, and Tyreek Hill is an amazing football player as well. So yeah, Tyreek Hill, there's no reason to fade him going into next year. We know that he is now one of the best wide receivers in the NFL, and regardless of who's throwing the ball to him, I mean, he even had some good games with Skylar Thompson and Teddy Bridgewater. He is quarterback proof at this point. Jay, same question over to you. Who's your favorite wide receiver pick from last year?
Yeah, mine is Christian Kirk, and I missed out a lot on Christian Kirk. So it was somebody that I was paying a lot of attention to because it was I was kind of waiting for it to break, and he was consistent. He was good all season. So he was drafted as the wide receiver 35, 77th off the board, which is like 6th, 7th round range. So, you spent a good pick on him, but he finished wide receiver 19, averaged 14 points per game. So, with a couple of my players, him, Ramondre as well, aren't guys that necessarily broke fantasy, but they were guys that were consistent for you week in and week out that you got at great values. Which was interesting to me were the 5 receivers that were drafted ahead of Christian Kirk was Michael Thomas, Adam Thielen, Rashad Bateman, Amari Cooper, and Elijah Moore. So Amari Cooper, obviously, great pick at value as well. But if you took Michael Thomas, Adam Thielen, Bateman, or Elijah Moore, I'm sure you were looking back at that Christian Kirk pick, wishing you picked him. So he had 133 targets this year. And, it was he was productive before he went to Jacksonville, but I think we all got a little scared with the following the money type thing. Christian Kirk got a huge contract this offseason. We as fantasy players have been burned by following the money in the past. Dave, I know you and I both got burned by the Patriots tight ends and Jonnu Smith in the past.
And Kenny Galladay.
It can be a dangerous thing following the money, but sometimes when it works out and there is that big of an opportunity there, like Christian Kirk had, he took advantage of it. And it'll be interesting next year, with Calvin Ridley coming in, seeing kind of how that shapes out. But, Jacksonville had a productive season offensively, and Christian Kirk was a catalyst of that.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest takeaways from Christian Kirk's breakout is that Cliff Kingsbury absolutely deserved to be fired because he had this guy on his team for 4 years and could not figure out how to utilize him. And then he shows up in Jacksonville and is immediately just looking like a great wide receiver. So again, you're talking about following the money a little bit. There have been a lot of guys that kind of get lumped into that Christian Kirk tier where they aren't a difference maker. People don't think they can be a wide receiver one. And it just so happens that those are the guys that are kind of the top of the free agent wide receiver list this year when you're looking at Jacoby Myers and Allen Lazard and Juju Smith-Schuster. So, Jay, if any of these guys sign big money contracts on teams that are desperate for a wide receiver one, similar to the position that we saw Christian Kirk in last year, who do you think has the best chance out of these wide receivers to step up in 2023?
Oh, you're going right down my alley. I love Jacoby Myers, man. I'm a big Jacoby Myers fan. I have been a fan of him, and I've benefited from being a fan of Jacoby Myers in the past years. He's been a great value year in and year out. And I just think he's really talented. I mean, when you watch him, he's really good. And he's just in a situation that doesn't show that enough. But when he's on the field, I mean, he earns targets like some of the best in the league. And I think it will be interesting to see where he goes and the kind of situation he gets put in. I hope he gets, kind of a role in a more high-powered offense that we get to see really what the potential is because he excites me. I'm a big fan of him. So he's the one that I would choose where I think kind of different. I mean, I could see it with Juju as well, but somebody like Jacoby is, we really haven't seen the downside of him yet. We've just kind of seen him be untapped. So I would like to see what it is when he reaches his full potential.
Yeah, and the whole time you were talking there, I'm sure Pat and I just looked like bobbleheads, just going right along with everything you were saying. We talked about Jacoby Myers on his show just a couple of weeks ago, and Pat, I think you and I are both in the same kind of opinion here that Jacoby Myers could be the guy to really step up as a wide receiver one next year, right?
Yeah, and the only knock really on him earlier in his career was that he wasn't scoring touchdowns and that there weren't a lot of big plays, but now he's kind of started scoring more touchdowns. I don't think he's ever going to be a big touchdown guy or a big play guy, a guy who's consistently ripping off 30 or 40-yard gains. But I mean, hello, Keenan Allen. That's kind of been Keenan Allen's career. So I do think he could have sort of a second act to his career that looks a lot like Keenan Allen.
Yeah, or a lot like Christian Kirk in 2022. Now we're going to stick on the best picks and wrap up with tight ends here. Pat, you took the chalk. Tell us why Travis Kelce was the best pick you could have made this year.
Yeah, I mean, and I guess there are other guys I technically could have taken, Evan Ingram, David Njoku, but in a way I feel like those fall under the lucky pick categories because those guys had flamed out so many other years before. And I always struggle with the dilemma of whether to consider taking Travis Kelce in the first rounds of drafts. I tend not to do it in my managed leagues, but I'm more willing to do it in best ball leagues. I guess I just always feel like I'm behind the curve at the other positions, mainly running back and wide receiver, if I go for Kelsey in the first round, and like don't like the feeling of trying to play catch up at those other positions. But man, he's just such a difference maker at the position. I mean, it's like Travis Kelsey, and then, a big beyond a stiff arm's length between him and anyone else at the position. And we thought maybe, Mark Andrews, Kyle Pitts, George Kittle could come within shouting distance of him. No, not really. Andrews had a good start and faded. Hawkinson sort of came on late. Pitts didn't really pan out. So it's like Travis Kelsey and everyone else. So I think at this point, like, the people who did take that leap of faith with him in the first round, handsomely rewarded.
Yeah, and I talked about this again. I keep alluding to other shows that I've been on recently, but I was talking with Alfredo Brown a couple weeks ago on the Pretend GM, and we were deciding where Travis Kelsey deserves to be drafted in 2023. And it's kind of crazy because when you look at it, he's getting up there in age, 33 years old now. But 33 for a tight end is very different than 33 for a wide receiver. We've seen guys like Antonio Gates and Tony Gonzalez continue to put up 800, 900-yard seasons into their late 30s. I mean, Tony Gonzalez was putting up 900 yards a year at 38, 39 years old. So I personally think that Travis Kelsey still has, somewhere between 2, possibly up to as many as 5 elite years ahead of him. So I've got him right now on my big board as the number 2 pick in PPR leagues behind only Justin Jefferson. Pat, am I crazy for taking him second overall?
No, I was listening to the great Bob Harris and Mike Dempsey on Sirius XM a while ago, and they were talking about what they would do with 101. And the 3 names they were kicking around were Justin Jefferson, Travis Kelsey, and Christian McCaffrey. And, I think Bob said that if he had like 10 101 picks to spread around, he would kind of spread the bets around, and probably 1 or 2 of those would be on Kelsey. So I don't think that's crazy at all.
Jay, before we hear about your tight end, let me throw the same question to you. Where are you willing to take Travis Kelsey this year? Are you willing to take him that high, or are you hoping that he slips into that 1-2 turn again?
I would say in the past have been similar to Pat, where I think it makes sense. I just haven't really been the one to pull the trigger on it. And year after year, man, I am burned for not doing it. So I think going into next year, I think that makes sense to take him in the first round. This gap is just so massive, and I'm a huge Mark Andrews fan, but it is not comparable. Travis Kelsey just is, consistently breaking the tight end landscape every single year. So I think, taking him in the mid first, mid to late first isn't bad. 102 is rich for me, but I can't really fault it. Like I said, I'll just probably be wrong again if I don't take him there. So
here's my take. People don't like drafting Travis Kelsey because your team looks ugly if you do it. And that's really it. Like, you can't share your team on Twitter and be like, hey, look at this awesome team I drafted, when you don't have an elite running back, you don't have an elite wide receiver. Like Travis Kelsey, you just can't build a sexy team around Travis Kelsey. But a lot of my best teams this year were where I started off with Travis Kelsey, got myself an elite running back, and then got some of the running backs we talked about earlier, Josh Jacobs, Ramondre Stevenson. So I kind of came into the industry as this zero wide receiver tout, wait and get your wide receivers. But it seems like every year I start veering more and more into the zero running back crowd because it seems like you can build some strong teams that way. Now let's wrap up with the best picks. And Jay, who was your favorite tight end pick from last year?
Well, so as Pat mentioned, Evan Ingram, a very lucky pick. So I'm going to stray from that. And I even, kind of put in my notes here, you get 39-point game mixed in there. So, at the tight end position, if you have 39 points in one game, it's going to, take a large percentage of the points that you need to really finish high at the tight end position. He was drafted as tight end 22, 166th overall, which is like a 13th round pick. And points per game, he finished tight end 7, averaging a little over 10 points. And just a couple of guys going ahead of him were, Alberto, Irv Smith, other guys that, we were trying to tell ourselves we're going to work at that time. Similar to Evan Ingram, where, you miss out on those top tight ends and you're having to pick between these guys and kind of telling yourself one story or another. And to be fair, he burned everybody the year before. So I don't blame people for not picking him. I really only invested in Evan Ingram in best ball. I didn't really draft him on any of my managed teams. I took him in best ball when I was making Trevor Lawrence stacks, and it worked out.
18th round, he was free in best ball leagues this year. It was crazy.
It worked out very nicely for that. But this year, oddly enough, it was his third most targets over his career. So he actually had broken 100 in 2020, and then he had more in 2017 as well. But he had his most receptions and most yards this season. So. And, really lucky pick to hit on Evan Ingram, and somebody that, you would have had to just throw a dart on. But for me, and kind of talking about these tight ends, unless you really have, Travis Kelce or one or two other guys, you're throwing darts. So he was one of the better picks at the end of the day. And, everyone was lucky to get Evan Ingram. I will say that.
And you are on an Evan Ingram fanboy show right now. I love Evan Ingram. I mean, just you're looking at the historic rookie year that he had, the first round draft capital. Things never really seemed to work out in New York for whatever reason, but I was all aboard the Evan Ingram hype train this year for Doug Peterson. And Jay, being an Eagles fan, you know about it. Doug Peterson loves his tight ends. I mean, back when he was with Travis Kelce, when Travis Kelce was early on and he was an offensive coordinator, they ran that offense through Travis Kelce. Then he went to Philly, and whether it was Trey Burton or Richard Rodgers or obviously Dallas Goedert and Zach Ertz, he just found a way to get the ball into his tight ends' hands. And then this offseason, the first two acquisitions they made were Evan Ingram and Dan Arnold. And I said, well, I'm drafting both of these guys because one of them is going to pop, and it just ended up being Evan Ingram. So really excited to see what he does next year. But I have a feeling that he's going to end up cracking that top 5, maybe top 6. And as much as I love Evan Ingram, I don't know if I'm going to be able to pull the trigger in the 7th or 8th round if that's where he's getting drafted. Now, before we get into our worst picks, I want to talk about our Footballguys rookie draft guide that just came out. If you're looking to build a dynasty, Footballguys is here to help you. Our 2023 rookie draft guide will help you identify players to dominate your dynasty fantasy football leagues with in-depth statistics, rankings, expert-based film analysis on 120 NFL prospects. You'll get to find out about sleepers and studs of the 2023 class. You'll understand the context behind their college production and gain the edge that you need to win your league. The first edition of the Rookie Draft Guide is available right now, and you can find that link in the description below. Best of all, it is 100% free, packed with information and analysis on, like I said, 120 NFL prospects. Each profile is going to include scouting reports, strengths and weaknesses, ideal fits as far as scheme analysis goes, historical stats, and so much more. Plus, you'll get our big board cheat sheets and both Superflex and single quarterback leagues. You can download all 120 plus pages for free at join.footballguys.com/rookie guide. Like I said, the link is in the description below. Guys, I don't know if you've had a chance to check this out yet, but it was Jeff Bell, Christian Williams, and Kevin Coleman. They went to work on this thing, and it is immaculate. Like I said, over 120 rookie prospects already. Put this out in January. Just unbelievable to see. Could not recommend it enough. But anyway, let's go ahead and get into the worst picks now. We had fun to start off the show. Now it's time to talk about the pain, and these scars might still be a little bit fresh here. But Jay, start us off. Who was the worst quarterback that you could have drafted last year, in your opinion?
Well, I hate to just keep throwing him under the bus because he's dealt with enough, but Russell Wilson was the worst pick for me. And interestingly enough, the kind of reasoning why was because of how hard it was to realize that he was a bad pick, because we all had high expectations going into the season. He was drafted as QB9, 81st overall, so 6th, 7th round range, right after, kind of that tier that we expected, the top guys in the Jalen Hurts, Kyler Murray range. So 6th, 7th round, but he finished as QB 17 points per game, averaging 15 points. He only went over 20 points twice, under 15 9 times. That's tough at your quarterback position. And it was really tough because, like I said, you had to really think it'll get better. And, the narrator steps in and says, well, it didn't. And it didn't get much better. So there were guys, like Tua, Justin Fields, Trevor Lawrence that you could have waited on. And, it's in hindsight, it's easy to, hate on it and say, it was a bad pick, but we were all excited. The offense looked great. And so that almost made it a worse pick for me when it was actually happening, because you're sitting there being like, do I replace him? Do I pick up someone else? Am I going to drop him and he's going to score 35 points, And so it was a really tough decision. I think a lot of people went through, like you said, a lot of pain when they drafted Russell Wilson.
Yeah, and the tough thing is, I feel like Nathaniel Hackett was kind of the punching bag and the scapegoat. But the weird thing is Russ just didn't look good. I mean, just flat out missing easy throws. He'd have a wide open guy 5 yards away from him and just sailed over his head or throw it at his feet. It was not the Russ Wilson that I had seen, in the earlier part of his career with Seattle. Pat, before we hear about your quarterback, I want to know if you've got any insight as to what happened with Russell Wilson last year.
One of the things to me is, I'm also a fellow Wisconsin Badger like Russell Wilson. So I've been, watching him for a long time. And the one thing that I thought made him special was his ability to spin away from the pass rush. Like he had that move where he would make this, like he'd have a guy zeroing in on him, make this tight little spin move to the outside. Then all of a sudden he's running loose, buying his receivers time to get open downfield. And like, that's when the big plays and the magic would happen. I've not seen him do that move very often in recent years. And maybe it's just his age, but like, I don't feel like he has that escapability anymore.
Yeah, and the other thing is if you look at his rushing yards, I mean, he was never a Konami QB in the same respect that Justin Fields and Lamar Jackson, but you can count on him for like 300 to 400 rushing yards every single year. That just fell off a cliff a few years ago, so he doesn't have that rushing upside anymore. And I think what makes the Russ Wilson pick even more painful is it wasn't just Russ Wilson. It was the entire Denver offense that ended up floundering because of Russ Wilson. So people were putting third-round draft capital into Cortland Sutton, drafting Jerry Jeudy in the 6th round, and yeah, he showed some flashes at the end of the season, but I mean, there really just weren't a lot of bright spots in Denver this year. So completely agree with you, Jay. That was just an abysmal pick that you could have made. Pat, same question over to you. Who was your least favorite, just the worst pick that you could have made at QB position last year?
So Justin Herbert is kind of a sacred cow, I think, because he's really talented and young and good looking, but maybe he shouldn't be such a sacred cow. Herbert was going in the 3rd or 4th round of drafts last year. He would go always ahead of Jalen Hurts, pretty much always ahead of Joe Burrow, even though I'm proud to say I was one of the few people who had Burrow ranked higher than Herbert in redraft and dynasty coming into this year. I even was in drafts in like basketball where he would go ahead of Patrick Mahomes a couple of times, which always just floored me. So obviously expectations were really high. He averaged about 17 points a game, which is just utterly average. And, you know, I think Russell Wilson was a great call by Jay, but in reality, Wilson only averaged like 1.3 fewer points per game than Herbert and was not really being taken with premium picks the way Herbert was. I mean, there was a real opportunity cost to grabbing him that early in drafts, you know, good wide receivers, good running backs on the board in the 3rd and 4th round. So, yeah, I mean, maybe it was Joe Lombardi. Maybe that was he's partly to blame. And, you know, maybe Kellen Moore will help improve things, but his TDs were way down from the last 2 years. Sacks were up. His YPA cratered. And, you know, or at least I hope it cratered at 6.8 yards. So we'll see what's in his future, but yeah, he was just really disappointing, I think.
Yeah, and it's so tough to talk badly about Justin Herbert because of what we saw the first couple of years of his career. I think a big part of last year, you got to take the rib injury into account. You know, they never said it was broken ribs. I think, what do they say, like a rib cartilage injury? But after that injury, it seemed like for the next 4 or 5 weeks, he wasn't himself. You know, he couldn't throw the ball downfield. He had almost no mobility, which, you know, really hampered his escapability in the pocket. But even then, once that injury was seemingly behind him and we saw him, you know, trying to pick up 4th downs with his legs and throwing the ball a little bit further downfield, he was just kind of off all season. Like, you know, he wasn't the same Justin Herbert that we saw through his first 2 years. So I think Herbert's going to end up being one of the most polarizing guys of the 2023 offseason because you're going to have his touts that really fell in love with him saying, no, it's Justin Herbert. He's still a top 5 quarterback. And then you're going to have other people that are going to look at the production last year and say, I want nothing to do with this guy at ADP. So I'm really interested to see where he lands in drafts next year. But yeah, can't make any argument against him not being a terrible pick last year. Let's switch over to running backs now. Jay, who was your least favorite running back pick from last year?
This one's tough for me, but I did choose DeAndre Swift, and I'll have to, give a little bit of an explanation on it because I don't think he was a terrible pick in general. I mean, he wasn't just terrible every week, but it was the guys that were going around him that you could have had in the mid-second round that you took DeAndre Swift over. I mean, it was Nick Chubb, it was Saquon Barkley, Tyreek Hill, A.J. Brown. I mean, league-winning type of guys that, you were drafting DeAndre Swift, and week to week you were wondering how many touches is he going to get? Is he going to be healthy? Or do the Lions still like him? You were wondering all sorts of things about DeAndre Swift. And I think the optimists, you were hoping that he would have kind of an Austin Eckler type of profile and be able to do that. But it was tough for him. And I think that was, kind of the reasoning. It was just how high he was being drafted. I mean, even in best ball, there were times he was going as like 12th overall, 13th overall, like right at the 1-2 turn. And it was just tough. And, Saquon has his own detractors that were holding us back from Saquon. But I mean, just when you look at that full profile now that we saw it, and again in hindsight, I mean, it's just that he has that passing down work, was also kind of the workhorse guy. The offense is going to revolve around him. So just having him over some of those other running backs that you could have had, even some of those wide receivers, I think made him a tough pick. He did miss 3 games, and he split with Jamal Williams, which was tough. And Jamal Williams won people a lot of money in a lot of games, so not so bad in general for the Lions backfield. But for DeAndre Swift, I think it was really frustrating for how highly you invested in him if you drafted him. And
I think. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think frustrating is the perfect word to sum up the DeAndre Swift season, because I had DeAndre Swift in a ton of teams, and he was showing you just enough every single week that you could never bench him. Like, if you had DeAndre Swift, you were still starting him every single week. And to see him, rip off a huge play, get down to the 1 yard line, and then Jamal Williams comes trotting in off the sideline every single week, it was beyond frustrating.
I had a team with DeAndre Swift and Jamal Williams, and multiple times started DeAndre Swift over Jamal Williams and got burned for it. And it was tough because, I didn't want to drop Jamal Williams or get rid of either of them. They were both semi-productive players, and I mean Jamal a much higher level. But it was tough, and there were weeks where I had to make that decision, and weeks where I'm watching Lions games. And Jamal Williams, for some reason, is always on the 1 yard line, and just rolling in touchdowns. So.
And the thing is, DeAndre Swift was wildly efficient when he got those red zone and goal line touches too. Like, anytime he got a goal line touch, it seemed like he would score, but they just kept going to Jamal Williams. So Jamal Williams was on a short deal where he's an unrestricted free agent now. We got to hope that Jamal Williams walks, but man, it just feels like he is the heart and soul of that team. I mean, everybody in Detroit just seems to love him. It wouldn't surprise me if they bring him back. So if Jamal Williams ends up in Detroit next year, how much are we penalizing DeAndre Swift for this? I mean, are you realistically, if Jamal Williams is a Detroit Lion next year, I don't know if I'm even thinking about touching DeAndre Swift before the 4th or 5th round.
I would agree with that. And sorry, go ahead, Pat.
Oh, no. Yeah, I mean, we kind of saw that a little on Hard Knocks, didn't we? Like, Jamal Williams was like the guy everyone loved, the coaches, the players, the guy, like, they had a bad practice. He rallies the team around and like talks about how emotional it was to go through a losing season the year before. And I feel the same way. Like, if he resigns, I'm going to be seriously concerned about DeAndre Swift's role and whether it's going to increase at all.
And I think so much of it is because of the running back coach, Deuce Staley. Like, if you remember Deuce Staley as a football player, he was running through people, never avoiding contact. And that's not DeAndre Swift's game. DeAndre Swift is, I'm going to get out in the open field. I'm going to make tacklers miss. And you can see it on Hard Knocks that Deuce Staley was getting furious. Why aren't you finishing this run? Why aren't you running through the defender? And then you got Jamal Williams, who doesn't have that elite draft capital or profile or anything, but he will smash a guy in the mouth every single time he touches the football. And Deuce Staley just loved that about him.
I think DeAndre Swift also falls into that category of, as football fans, we watch him and he's a great football player. He does things that contribute to the game. The Lions, I'm sure, like what he does. When he gets on the field, he is productive. He is efficient, like you said. But for fantasy players, it's frustrating because he never really is able to reach his full potential in that sort of role. But at the same time, I don't think the Lions are that disappointed in his role. So, it's frustrating.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of frustrating running backs, Pat, why don't you talk to us about yours?
Najee Harris. And people are going to say, oh, it wasn't that bad. He was the RB14 and a half-point PPR. But that's survivor bias. He played all 17 games and, it just was never that good for him this year. RB2 production for a guy who was being drafted, near the end of the first round last year. And he was averaging kind of fewer points than that during the fantasy regular season, but then he had 2 pretty good games in week 17 and week 18, by which time the teams that drafted him were already probably out of the running and didn't do them any good. So yeah, really rough season for Najee Harris. And I don't know. I mean, I think it was just all sort of volume driven his first year. And, we saw that last year when he didn't get the same level of work.
Yeah, Najee Harris was a tough one. And yeah, his late season push where he started scoring some points kind of inflated his overall production, but all of his managers were out at that point in the season. So it didn't really matter when he kicked it on at the end of the year because they were all watching from the consolation bracket. So fully agree there. But are you buying into, do you still think that Najee Harris is a very good football player? We know that Mike Tomlin loves to feed his lead back. So are you going to have any qualms about drafting Najee Harris again next year?
Yeah, I mean, maybe if he goes into the dead zone, I think I'm probably not going to have a lot of him. I think there are going to be just too many wide receivers I like at the spot where Najee Harris is drafted.
Yeah, and in Dynasty, Najee falls into that area right now where like people are willing to buy for a second, but nobody wants to sell him for a first, and he's just kind of in this limbo where if you got him, you're stuck with him, you're not getting the return you want. Yeah, he's certainly been a frustrating one, kind of on that dare I say Trent Richardson career arc right now, which you don't like to see for a young running back. Let's switch over to wide receivers though. Jay, start us off. Who was your least favorite wide receiver pick?
Oh, he was really my least favorite because I had a lot of him as well, and it was Deontay Johnson. And it hurts, and it was something that I think we kind of had a inkling of before the season. Not too many good wide receivers have had successful seasons with a rookie quarterback coming in. Especially, I think we had questions of Kenny Pickett in general. The consensus at least did. Deontay started off relatively strong though to the season. He had 3 games where he had over 9 targets. Was actually semi-productive, kind of doing Deontay Johnson things where he gets a lot of targets, not a lot of yards, but gets your fantasy points in PPR leagues. His ADP was wide receiver 19, so he was going in the 3rd or 4th round, which is a pretty high pick for a guy that didn't score a touchdown all season long. Unfortunate. But he finished wide receiver 43, around 10 points per game in PPR. That's like the Josh Palmer range. Josh Palmer averaged 10 points per game. And no offense to Jay Palm, but we were expecting a little bit more from Deontay Johnson in his role. Guys that were drafted ahead of, he was drafted ahead of, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Christian Kirk, Devontae Smith. There were some tough decisions you had to make where you were just thinking, well, I trust Deontay's profile. I'm going to follow the targets, even though everything else is kind of not adding up. We expected it to be a crowded wide receiver room and Pat Freiermuth, just a crowded offense in general.
Catcher. Yeah.
Harris too. I mean, there's just so many guys in that offense. And we kind of had all these reasons to stay away from Deontay, but a lot of us still bought in for the same reasons that we did in prior years. And it was tough. His first 3 games, like I said, he had a good game. He had good weeks, but weeks 4 through 13, he only had over 10 points twice. So that's tough. You kind of had the beginning of the season, and he actually got hot at the end of the season a little bit too. So, like you said, when everyone was probably out on Deontay already, he kind of heated up again. So he was the most painful wide receiver pick for me, the worst one of the season.
Yeah, I tweeted something almost as soon as the season ended, and it was something along the lines of, obviously positive regression tells us that Deontay Johnson is going to bounce back next year, but I was concerned just because he's not a yards after the catch guy. He's not even really a contested catch guy. He doesn't get looks in the red zone. I was like, so he might just be a low touchdown type of guy forever, and I thought that I was going to be completely out on Deontay Johnson. Then I did a dynasty startup last week where I got a 26-year-old Deontay Johnson in the 8th round. So if he's going that low, if people are penalizing him that much for his bad 2022 season, I think I'm going to be jumping right back on board. As always, when we're talking about these players, it all comes down to ADP. And if Deontay Johnson is slipping far in redraft and dynasty like that, if you can get him for cheap, we know that he can get open. We know that he draws targets. So I think there might still be an opportunity to buy on Deontay Johnson. Pat, let's throw it over to you, though, and let's hear about your least favorite wide receiver pick.
Adam Thielen. And he was going in the 7th round of drafts, maybe sometimes the 8th round, because he had scored 24 touchdowns in the 2 years prior. But I think the drafters of Adam Thielen last year were sort of ignoring multi-year downward trends in some pretty key indicator categories like yards per catch, yards per target, yards per route run, targets per game. All of those things are just, year over year going the wrong way for Adam Thielen. And yet the expectation was that he was going to keep scoring touchdowns. Probably not a good conclusion to draw when he's playing with a young superstar receiver like Justin Jefferson. It was just kind of a wretched use of a pretty fairly early draft pick.
Yeah, couldn't agree more with you there. And those people that have been saying for the last 4 years, fade Adam Thielen, the touchdown regression is coming. They were finally right after they missed out on 3 very great years from the Adam Thielen. So, yeah, that's
me.
What I'm hoping.
That was me. You're just calling me out. You can call me out by name, Dave. That's okay.
That's all right, man. I've been wrong on Derrick Henry for 3 straight years, but you just wait. This year, Derrick Henry is going to be a bust. I've been saying it for years, but I might be right this year. Let's go ahead and wrap up though with tight ends. And this is tough to talk about because there were a lot of tight ends on the top end of the board that people were drafting very highly this year that really didn't give you the production that you were hoping for. Jay, start us off here.
Yeah, tight end is tough, because it's either it's really high end, with the Travis Kelce's of the world, and then kind of you were throwing darts, like I said earlier, when you're picking the best tight end. And mine is Dalton Schultz. I just felt like there was kind of a misconception of what he actually was. Last year, Kittle was out. Waller missed a lot of time. Dalton Schultz, I think, finished as the tight end 3 overall last season, which got a lot of people excited for this year. Their, Cowboys offense seemed exciting. Kellen Moore, we're all coming in excited. And tight end 6, wasn't like he finished that much lower. He finished tight end 9, but he averaged like under 10 points per game, averaged 9.5. And, he was still being drafted ahead of Dallas Goedert and TJ Hawkinson, which was tough to look back on. But again, it's not as much that he was a terrible pick. It was just based on the value where you had to draft him. He was pretty hot and cold all season. And, there were guys like Evan Engram, David Njoku, some of the later round picks that I think you would have preferred to have week to week. And you spent a pretty early pick on Dalton Schultz in the 5th, 6th round to give you kind of marginal production. And like I said, not so bad, but in the tight end landscape, it's kind of tough to pick because there aren't too many guys that were drafted that highly or had that high of expectations, because I think we understood the landscape is tough to begin with.
Yeah, and I think one of the most brutal things with Dalton Schultz is for people that drafted him, he had 3 touchdowns in his first 13 games this season, and then week 17, week 18, and the 2 playoff games that they played, over those 4 weeks, he scored 5 times. So for people that drafted, ponied up for tight end 6 and drafted Dalton Schultz, then just had to watch this guy go ham through the end of the season and the playoffs when the fantasy season was over. So makes that one sting even a little bit more. Pat, who is your least favorite tight end this year?
Boy, Darren Waller, who had a late 4th round ADP last year, and like we just knew Devontae Adams was going to come in and be a target vampire in Las Vegas, and so he lost targets to him. Plus, there was an elevated injury risk, I think it was safe to say, with Darren Waller. Plus, Waller was and still is on the wrong side of the bell curve for age. Although don't tell Travis Kelce that, it doesn't seem to bother him. So, yeah, I just thought there were a number of risk factors for Waller that probably made him not the optimal selection in the 4th round.
Yeah, that was a really tough one. And I'm just going to throw the honorable mention out there. I am blown away that neither of you guys picked Kyle Pitts, who was getting drafted as, the tight end 2 or tight end 3 in so many. And I get it, an injury ended his season, so that might feel like low-hanging fruit. But even before that injury, Kyle Pitts was brutal because, again, like DeAndre Swift, like we were talking about earlier, the usage was there that you had to keep starting Kyle Pitts every single week, and you were just getting 1.2 points here and 3.6 points here. That was my least favorite tight end pick, somebody that I had on over 30% of my best ball rosters last year.
Yeah, oh, go ahead, Jay.
I was going to say, yeah, for sure. He was the obvious pick, I think, almost in the whole fantasy landscape. If you asked all positions, Kyle Pitts might have been the most disappointing. To me, it almost felt like a low blow. I was like, this guy, we've talked about him so much, how disappointing he is, that and it's, yeah, it was just tough. It was frustrating to see how he was used this season, but you're completely right. He would have been a slam dunk pick.
Yeah, I feel like it was still a pretty good process pick, even though it, backfired horribly, and I certainly got scalded by the backfire. Just the fact that he had become the first tight end in 50 years since your guy Mike Ditka, Dave, to have a 1,000-yard rookie season for a tight end, and he did it with like kind of a dusty Matt Ryan. So I obviously I wasn't really excited about Marcus Mariota, but I thought he could still sort of make it work. And I guess we all just sort of assumed the next step was going to be a big one forward for Pitts rather than a big one backward.
Yeah, and insert the Denny Carter often used meme of the guy that's just fighting to hold back tears, and it says the process was right. And that's what it was with Mike Kyle Pitts. I'll probably be back on him again next year. What's up, Jay?
I was just going to say the same thing. I'm sure we're interested to see what's going to happen in Atlanta with their quarterbacks, but I was wondering where you guys are kind of thinking, in February as we are, but how are you valuing Kyle Pitts going into next year?
It can't be worse than Marcus Mariota, right? It can't possibly be worse than Marcus Mariota. I feel like anybody that they bring in, whether it's Ritter or if they trade up in the draft or if they bring in, Jimmy Garoppolo, Derek Carr, I feel like it can't possibly be a worse situation than last year.
Yeah, been debating whether to put him or Dallas Goedert higher in my rankings, and I noticed that the rest of the Fantasy Pro staff has Pitts ahead of Goddard, and I
Ooh.
was like as high on Pitts as anyone. I've still got Goddard there right now, but
Yeah, especially maybe in I mean, definitely in Dynasty, I prefer Pitts, but in redraft, I think I'm going Goddard over Pitts every
Yeah.
time.
yeah, I mean, unless Atlanta does something dramatic at quarterback, maybe if they brought in Derek Carr, who has floated, some big Darren Waller seasons, then maybe I, make that flip flop. But for now, I think I'd rather have Goddard.
Yeah,
I agree there. I'm not too concerned with Kyle Pitts in Dynasty. His Dynasty value doesn't concern me too much. It was that first year, his rookie season, doing what he did was special, and it was historic that he did it. And I think that was great. But I think we also kind of have to bake in, it has taken all these other tight ends some time to develop. So he did have that great season, but I wouldn't be surprised if he bounces back. And it was one of those things as well where I think we all expected the Falcons to be a little bit worse team than they were. And the fact that they kept winning those games was even more frustrating for why aren't you involving Kyle Pitts, and it kind of being like, well, I don't really have to, I guess. So it was very frustrating.
And let's bring it back full circle to what we were talking about with Evan Ingram, who had a historic rookie year and then 4 down seasons after that before finally breaking out. And that's what we see. I mean, Ryan McDowell posted it last year talking about the age apex for every single player. The average tight end doesn't break out until age 28. And I mean, Dallas Goedert right now is 28. And last year was the first year that he was like consistently, you could start him week in and week out. So it might just be one of those things where Kyle Pitts is still only 22 years old. We might still have to wait a few years to see him fully develop into the player he is.
Oh man, I hope he doesn't take the David Njoku career track where we don't see him really start crushing it until he's like in his 7th year.
Yeah, and that's just kind of the story of tight ends, unfortunately. Well, fellas, this was a blast. So glad that we are back with the Launchpad now. You can check this out every Friday afternoon, youtube.com/footballguys, and anywhere where you listen to podcasts, you'll be able to find this. Before we sign off, one more time, Pat, let everyone know where they can find you.
Yeah, at fantasypros.com. You can find all my stuff there. Check out the Fits on Fantasy podcast, the Fantasy Pros Dynasty podcast, and find me on Twitter at Fits_FF.
Jay, let everyone know where they can find you.
You can find me on Twitter at Arsht, first and last name there, and then at High Floor Football, which is at High Floor FB, which is going to be starting up again as well. We're going to get going during the off season and get some fantasy free agent, dynasty draft content going. So yeah.
Yeah, highly recommend your show actually for some draft analysis. I know I plugged the Football Guys rookie draft guide a little bit earlier, but I really got some good information leading up to last year's draft. You had that show with Thor Nystrom, and that was one of my favorite shows leading up to the draft last year. So definitely be sure to check out High Floor Football. Of course, I'm Dave Kluge. You can find me on Twitter at Dave Kluge. You can find all of my written and video content over at Football Guys. Thank you so much for checking this out, and I will see you next week. Thank you for tuning in. As always, be sure to give us a thumbs up as that's going to help drive some extra traffic to the page. If you're listening to this on audio, leave a 5-star review and let us know what you think. I'll be back next week for another episode of the Launchpad. But in the meantime, be sure to subscribe at youtube.com/footballguys to check out everything else that Football Guys has to offer. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you next week.